September 15th, 1944, 0630 hours. Peleliu Island, Palau Archipelago. The sun had barely cleared the Philippine Sea when the first wave of the 1st Marine Division hit White Beach 1. The landing craft ramps dropped into the surf. Marines jumped into waist-deep water, carrying 60 pounds of equipment, and ran toward a beach that was already killing them. The island was only 6 miles long and 2 miles wide. It looked manageable on the maps back aboard the troop transports. Marine commanders had estimated the operation would take 4 days. They were wrong for 70 days. Corporal Arthur Art Jackson of the 3rd Battalion. 7 Marines knew none of this yet. He knew only what every Marine who stepped onto Peleliu knew in those first minutes. The Japanese were not running. They were waiting, dug into a coral ridge system that American bombardment had barely touched. They were waiting with machine guns, mortars, and a defensive philosophy that the American military had not yet fully encountered in the Pacific War. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The island of Marines had landed on bore almost no resemblance to the intelligence photographs. The coral ridges had dominated Peleliu's interior. A formation the Marines would come to call the Ymerbergal were not simple hills. They were a labyrinth of jagged limestone outcroppings, caves, and interlocking firing positions that the Japanese 14th Infantry Division had spent months fortifying. The island had been under Japanese control since 1941. 3 years of engineering, of blasting interconnected tunnels into the coral, of positioning artillery pieces inside mountain openings that could be rolled forward to fire and rolled back to shelter before American aircraft could respond. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa commanded the roughly 10,800 Japanese defenders on Peleliu. He was not interested in the banzai charges that had defined earlier Pacific battles. He had different orders. Hold the island as long as possible. Inflict maximum casualties. Make the Americans pay a price so severe that the appetite for future island invasions would wane. Nakagawa's defensive system was built around a concept American planners had not fully anticipated. The Japanese called it fukaku, a method of defense in depth, using terrain and interconnected fortifications to channel attacking forces into kill zones. Each pillbox, each cave, each rifle pit was not an isolated position. It was a node in a larger network. Destroy one position, and adjacent positions could cover the gap. Advance on a cave, and a concealed bunker 50 yards away open fire on your flank. The geography of the Ymerbergal made the system almost perfectly suited to its terrain. The pre-landing naval and aerial bombardment had done less damage than anyone had expected. The coral ridges absorbed shells and bombs in ways that soft earth or sand did not. Japanese defenders inside the deeper tunnels, some driven 40 feet into limestone, had ridden out 3 days of bombardment with relative safety. When they emerged, their positions were largely intact. The 1st Marine Division had fought at Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester. They were not inexperienced men, but the terrain of Peleliu was unlike anything they had encountered. The temperature on the island during September 1944 regularly reached 115 degrees Fahrenheit in the open. The coral was razor-edged. Every fall, every scramble across rock drew blood. Boots wore through faster than replacements could be distributed. Men drank their entire day's water ration within hours of landing and still suffered from dehydration. The combination of extreme heat, brutal terrain, and a deeply fortified enemy force began extracting casualties from the moment the 1st Marines stepped ashore. 3rd Battalion. 7 Marines moved inland from the beach on the morning of September 15th, pressing toward the Ymerbergal's southern approaches. The battalion's objective was to clear the enemy from the ridgelines that dominated the airfield sitting at the center of the island. That airfield was the entire strategic reason for Operation Stalemate 2. Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur had determined that Peleliu's airfield could threaten the flank of the coming Philippine Liberation Campaign. Securing it was deemed essential. Art Jackson was 20 years old. He had been born in Cleveland, Ohio, and had enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1943 at the age of 18. He was not physically imposing. He stood 5 feet 10 inches and weighed approximately 165 pounds. What his fellow Marines noticed about him was something harder to quantify. He moved without hesitation in situations that froze other men. He processed danger in real time rather than flinching from it. His platoon sergeant had noted in training that Jackson possessed an unusual willingness to act on incomplete information, a quality that could get a man killed in some circumstances and was absolutely essential in others. On the morning of September 18th, 3 days into the battle, Jackson's company was pushing along the southern edge of the Umurbergal, trying to reduce a series of fortified positions that had stopped the battalion's advance completely. The problem was not courage. The 1st Marine Division had no shortage of courage. The problem was geometry. The Japanese pillboxes along this section of the ridge were positioned so that each one covered the approaches to its neighbors. A Marine assault on any single position immediately drew fire from 2 or 3 adjacent ones. The standard solution, bringing up supporting weapons, calling in artillery or air strikes, worked imperfectly in terrain where the target and the attacker were often less than 30 yards apart and where the coral absorbed explosive energy in unpredictable ways. Jackson's company had been taking fire from a cluster of 12 pillboxes for most of the morning. The pillboxes were positioned on a low coral ridge approximately 200 yards from the Marine line. They were constructed from coral blocks and reinforced concrete, with firing apertures just wide enough to allow a machine gun to traverse a field of fire. Each aperture was roughly 18 inches wide and 8 inches tall. They were nearly impervious to small arms fire. They required direct hits from heavier weapons to neutralize, and the terrain made positioning those weapons difficult. The Marines had brought a flamethrower team forward earlier that morning. The lead operator had been shot and killed before he reached effective range. The assistant operator had dragged the equipment back under fire. A second attempt using demolition charges had eliminated 2 of the 12 positions at a cost of 4 Marines killed and 6 wounded. Jackson had watched both attempts from a shallow depression in the coral approximately 150 yards from the nearest pillbox. He had counted the firing positions, tracked their fields of fire, and identified the gap in coverage that existed between the 3rd and 4th positions from the right end of the line. It was small, perhaps a 15-yard corridor where the overlapping fires from adjacent bunkers did not quite reach. It was not safe. Nothing on that ridge was safe, but it was less immediately fatal than the other approaches. He took a grenadier's satchel of demolition charges from a Marine who had been wounded in the shoulder and could no longer carry it effectively. He checked the charges, 12 blocks of C, 2 explosive with pull wire fuses. He slung the satchel over his left shoulder, picked up his M1 Garand, and told the Marine next to him what he was going to do. The Marine said nothing for a moment. Then he told Jackson he was out of his mind. Jackson agreed with him and began moving forward. What happened in the next 2 hours on that coral ridge on Peleliu was documented in after-action reports, witness statements, and the Medal of Honor citation that was eventually prepared on Jackson's behalf. The facts of it are extraordinary enough without embellishment. They require no inflation. Jackson moved through the gap in the Japanese fields of fire at a low crawl, using the coral outcropping for cover. The noise of the ongoing firefight to his left provided some masking. He reached the base of the ridge and pressed himself against the coral face below the first pillbox. Inside, he could hear the mechanical rhythm of a Type 96 light machine gun, the Japanese weapon that fired a 6.5 millimeter round at approximately 500 rounds per minute, noticeably slower than the American Browning, but reliable and accurate in the hands of a trained crew. He pulled the fuse wire on a demolition charge and thrust the charge through the firing aperture. The confined space of a coral pillbox amplified the blast in a way that open-air detonation did not. The concussion was severe enough to incapacitate or kill a crew even when the physical damage to the structure appeared minor. The explosion came 5 seconds after Jackson had already moved to the right, pressing his body against the coral to stay below the line of sight. From the next position, he worked down the line, not at a sprint, not in a straight path, but moving in short bounds between whatever cover the broken coral terrain offered. Some charges went through apertures. When the aperture angle was wrong, he placed charges against the base of the structure where the coral blocks met the ground, exploiting the weakness at the foundation rather than the face. He was improvising under fire, adapting his approach to each structure based on what the ground and the geometry allowed. At the 4th pillbox, the approach required crossing approximately 8 yards of open ground with no cover at all. The position to his left, one he had not yet reached, had a clear line of sight to that ground. Jackson spent 45 seconds in the shelter of a coral boulder, studying the firing aperture of the covering position. The machine gun in that aperture was firing in long bursts at the marine line below, then pausing as the crew reloaded. The reload took approximately 7 to 8 seconds. It was not enough time to cross the open ground and place a charge and return to cover, but it was enough time to cross the open ground and stay. He moved on the next reload pause and reached the base of the fourth pillbox while the covering gun was still reloading. He placed his charge and detonated it before the crew of the covering position finished their own reload and returned their attention to his sector. The blast came. The fourth position went silent. He continued along the line. By the time Jackson had worked his way across 6 of the 12 positions, the Japanese defenders in the remaining bunkers had recognized that something was moving along their line from within their own perimeter. Orders were shouted in Japanese across the ridge. 2 Japanese soldiers emerged from a connecting trench between pillboxes 6 and 7 to investigate. Jackson killed them both with his Garand at a range of less than 20 feet. The sound of those shots told the Marines below that Jackson was still alive and still moving. Several of his fellow Marines had been watching his progress on the Marine line, unable to provide direct support without risking fire into his position. His platoon sergeant later said in his witness statement that watching Jackson work that ridge from below was among the most singular things he had seen in 2 years of Pacific combat. Jackson reached the 7th position and found the aperture facing away from him. The bunker had been constructed to fire toward the Marine line, not backward toward the ridge interior. He went over the top of it. He placed his charge on the ventilation opening in the roof, a construction feature common to Japanese coral pillboxes designed to prevent gas buildup from sustained firing inside a sealed structure. The charge detonated downward through the ventilation aperture. The position went silent. He was now 7 positions into a line of 12. He had used 9 of his 12 demolition charges. He had 3 charges left for 5 remaining positions. He needed more explosive. Jackson retreated back along the ridge interior, moving toward a position where 2 Japanese soldiers had been killed in a trench earlier that morning by Marine mortar fire. He had noted, while moving forward, that one of those soldiers had been carrying a satchel. In the Pacific War, Japanese infantry often carried their own demolition equipment. Sachets of picric acid blocks used for fortification destruction and anti-tank work. The blocks were cylindrical, approximately the size of a large tin can, and contained about 200 grams of explosive each. The satchel held 6 blocks. Jackson collected them. He returned to the ridge line and continued. The remaining 5 positions took another 40 minutes. He used American C, 2 charges where construction allowed it, and Japanese picric acid blocks where it did not. 1 position required him to crawl to within arm's reach of the firing aperture, while the crew inside was actively firing at the Marine line below. The gun's traverse could not depress low enough to engage a target directly beneath it. Jackson placed his charge at the aperture base from a position the weapon literally could not reach, fused it, and moved. By 1100 hours, all 12 positions on that section of the ridge had been neutralized. The Japanese machine gun fire that had stopped the battalion's advance since early morning had ceased. Jackson returned to the Marine line. His platoon sergeant asked him if he was wounded. Jackson checked himself. A piece of coral had opened a cut along his left forearm. He had not noticed it during the action. His utilities were torn at both knees from crawling across the sharp coral surface. His hands were bleeding from the same cause. He had expended all 12 American demolition charges and 6 Japanese picric acid blocks. He had fired his Garand 11 times. He sat down behind a coral outcropping and drank the last of his water. The battalion's advance resumed within the hour. What the after-action reports could not fully capture, what the formal language of citations and battalion logs could only gesture toward, was the texture of what Jackson had just survived. The coral ridges of the Immerbergal did not simply present a military obstacle. They presented a sensory environment unlike anything the Marine Corps had trained its men to expect. The limestone surface of Peleliu was not the kind of rock you could grip reliably. It fractured along unpredictable lines, crumbling under weight in one place and holding firm inches away. Every surface was edged, Marines who had trained on the dirt ranges of Camp Lejeune and the volcanic sand of Pacific staging areas found that the coral cut through boot leather in days rather than weeks. It opened wounds through clothing with no more force than a stumble. It reflected heat upward from the ground the way a cast iron pan holds heat from a flame. In the direct September sun of the Central Pacific, the surface temperature of exposed coral on Peleliu reached levels that burned through the knees of utilities during a low crawl. The water situation was, by the assessment of every Marine who survived the campaign, among the worst material conditions the 1st Division ever faced. The division had landed with individual canteens and resupply expectations built around previous Pacific operations. Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester had been jungle environments where temperature, though oppressive, rarely exceeded 95 degrees. Peleliu was different. The coral interior of the island created a natural heat sink. Temperatures on the ridgelines during the daylight hours of September and early October 1944 consistently exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit and were recorded as high as 115 in exposed positions. The human body requires approximately 1 quart water per hour during sustained exertion in those conditions. Marines on Peleliu were allocated less than half that in the early days of the campaign. A quartermaster error in the initial resupply compounded the problem severely. Water had been stored in fuel drums that had not been adequately cleaned, and the first batches distributed to forward units carried a petroleum contamination that caused vomiting and accelerated dehydration in the men who drank it. The medical reports from the campaign's first week document heat casualties at a rate that rivaled combat wounds in some units. Men who had survived the beach assault and the initial push inland were being carried out of line, not from enemy fire, but from their own bodies shutting down in the heat. Jackson's company operated in these conditions from the 15th of September onward. By the 18th, the day of the pillbox action, the company had already lost nearly 30% of its strength, some to enemy fire, some to heat, some to the coral itself, which opened wounds that became infected with speed that the island's climate accelerated. The battalion surgeon's notes from this period described treating coral lacerations that had developed serious infection within 36 hours in men who had received adequate first aid immediately after the wound. The bacteria present in the island's environment, combined with the heat and the inability to keep wounds clean in combat conditions, turned injuries that would have been minor in another theater into serious medical problems on Peleliu. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. It was in this environment, dehydrated, operating at the edge of physical endurance, surrounded by terrain designed to kill him, that Jackson returned to line after the pillbox action and prepared to go out again, because the 12 positions he had destroyed that morning were not the end of the problem. They were one section of a much larger fortified network. The Ymerbergall complex that Colonel Nakagawa had prepared held an estimated 500 individual fighting positions of varying size and construction, from single-man rifle pits cut into the coral to multi-chamber cave systems capable of housing entire companies of Japanese infantry with supplies to sustain them for months. The positions Jackson had cleared that morning represented approximately 2% of the total defensive works on the island. The 1st Marine Division had been told the operation would last 4 days. They were now on day 3. The men who had planned the operation from headquarters ships offshore had based their estimate on a fundamental misreading of what the Ymerbergall represented. Previous Japanese defensive efforts in the Pacific had relied on beach defense and counterattack. Japanese doctrine up through 1943 had emphasized holding the shoreline, making the landing itself the killing ground, then launching mass night counterattacks to drive the Americans back into the sea. This doctrine had been expensive for the Japanese. It had produced spectacular last stands, and it had produced massive Japanese casualties in open terrain where American firepower was most effective. Nakagawa's approach on Peleliu was a deliberate departure from that doctrine. He had received explicit orders from Imperial General Headquarters to abandon the beach defense model and adopt the elastic defense in depth that the Ymerbergall's terrain made possible. His job was not to defeat the American landing. His job was to make the Americans pay the maximum possible price for every yard of inland advance. To do this, He needed his men alive and in position, not expended in nighttime banzai charges across open ground. He had ordered his garrison to hold their caves and bunkers, to resist the instinct toward mass assault, and to trust that the terrain would do a large share of the killing on his behalf. The intelligence failure that had led to the 4-day estimate was, at its core, a failure to understand the shift in Japanese defensive doctrine. American planners had estimated Japanese strength on Peleliu at approximately 5,000 men, and had projected that the pre-landing bombardment would eliminate a significant portion of fighting capacity before the Marines stepped ashore. Both estimates were wrong. Japanese strength was more than double projected figure, and the bombardment, for all its violence, had done far less damage to the underground defensive network than the reconnaissance photographs suggested. General William Rupertus, commanding the 1st Marine Division, had publicly predicted the island would fall in 4 days. By the time Jackson was working his way down the pillbox line on the 18th of September, for days had already passed, and the division was deeply committed to a battle that bore no resemblance to the timetable anyone had projected. The fighting in the Ymerbergal through the remainder of September was the kind of combat that defies summary. It happened in small spaces, at the entrance to a cave, inside a connecting trench, across 10 yards of broken coral. The scale of individual engagements was often tiny. A single Marine and a single Japanese soldier, or 3 Marines and a machine gun crew, or one squad trying to reduce one bunker, while another squad provided suppressing fire from a position they themselves were being fired upon from. The Ymerbergal had been engineered by Nakagawa to prevent any individual engagement from remaining small for long. Because each position was covered by adjacent positions, every local fight had potential to draw fire from multiple directions simultaneously. Jackson was involved in this fighting every day from the 18th onward. The battalion continued pressing into the southern approaches of the ridge complex, and Jackson's consistent willingness to move forward into contested ground made him a consistent presence at the point of the advance. On the 19th of September, his company encountered position that had stopped forward movement entirely, a large reinforced bunker at the base of a coral prominence that covered the only practical approach route along that section of the ridge. The bunker was larger than the pillboxes Jackson had destroyed the previous day. It had been constructed with multiple firing ports and was connected by a covered trench to a second position approximately 30 yards behind it. The 2 positions were mutually supportive. Eliminating the forward bunker, while the rear position remained intact, would expose the assault element to fire from the rear position at close range. Eliminating the rear position first required moving to the forward bunker's field of fire. Jackson studied the problem for most of a morning. The approach that eventually presented itself was not a gap in coverage. There was no gap of meaningful size in this position's field of fire. What there was, instead, was a slight depression in the coral surface approximately 40 yards to the right of the bunker's main aperture. The depression was not deep enough to provide genuine cover. A man lying flat in it would have perhaps 6 inches of coral between himself and the direct line of sight from the bunker aperture. 6 inches of coral was not protection in any meaningful tactical sense, but it was concealment, and in the specific geometry of this position, concealment at that angle might be enough. Jackson moved the depression under covering fire from his platoon. He reached it without being hit. The Japanese gunner in the forward bunker was actively engaging the Marine line to Jackson's left and did not immediately register a single man moving to his right flank. Jackson lay flat in the depression and worked his way along it toward the bunker 6 inches at a time. He was close enough to the bunker, at the end of this approach, to hear the Japanese crew talking inside. He placed 3 demolition charges at the base of the forward bunker, 1 at each corner and 1 at the main aperture, and detonated them in sequence. The forward position was destroyed. The rear position opened fire immediately as expected, but the distance from the rear position to where Jackson lay at the base of the destroyed forward bunker was now less than 30 yards, and the coral rubble from the detonation provided cover that had not existed before the blast. He used that rubble. He moved through it to within grenade range of the rear position and put 2 fragmentation grenades through its firing aperture before the crew could reorient their weapon to engage him. The approach route that had been blocked all morning was now open. His company moved through it within the hour. This pattern, Jackson identified an approach that no one else had taken because no one else had been willing to accept its risk executing that approach and opening ground for the unit's advance, repeated itself across the final weeks of September and into October. The citations prepared on his behalf and the witness statements collected from his platoon and company document specific actions on at least 6 separate days between the 18th of September and the 12th of October. The cumulative toll of the sustained forward action on a single man was severe and was compounded by the island's environmental conditions. The coral wounds that had opened on his hands and knees during the first pillbox action never fully healed. There was no time off the line, no period of rest that would have allowed them to close properly. They reopened with each day's work across the coral surface. By early October, his hands were wrapped in field dressings that he changed when the corpsman could reach him and ignored when he could not. He was not unique in this. Every man in his company was operating under similar physical strain. The 1st Marine Division's medical records from Peleliu document a casualty pattern that was unusual even by Pacific War standards, a far higher proportion of non-battle casualties, primarily heat and physical exhaustion, alongside the combat wounds. Men who had survived months of jungle fighting on Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester were being broken by Peleliu's terrain and climate in ways that direct enemy fire alone would not have accomplished. The Japanese defenders, by contrast, had the advantage of their caves. The tunnel systems of the Immerbergal provided shelter from both the heat and American fire. Japanese soldiers could withdraw into the mountain interior during the hottest parts of the day, rotating their forward garrison, while the relief rested in the comparative coolness of the deeper tunnels. Nakagawa's system was not comfortable. Japanese supply lines of Peleliu had been significantly disrupted by American naval and air operations, and the garrison was operating on reduced rations of food and water by mid-September. But the caves provided something the Marines attacking uphill across open coral did not have: shade. In the Central Pacific heat of September 1944, shade was a form of combat power. The 1st Marine Division was pulled off the line in late September and replaced by the Army's 81st Infantry Division, the Wildcats, who continued reduction of the Immerbergal pocket through October and into November. The Marines had carried the heaviest fighting of the campaign's first 5 weeks. Their casualties were the highest proportion of any Pacific operation to that point. The 1st Marine Division lost approximately 1,250 killed and more than 5,000 wounded on Peleliu. Total casualties across the operation, including Army units and supporting personnel, exceeded 9,000. The number that became most associated with Peleliu in the years and decades that followed was not the casualty count, but the ratio. The 1st Marine Division suffered a casualty rate of approximately 36%. Meaning more than 1 in 3 men who landed on Peleliu became a casualty. It was the highest proportional loss rate of any Marine Division-level operation in the Second World War. Colonel Nakagawa defended the Immerbergal until the 24th of November, 1944, 73 days after the Marines first landed. He had been ordered to hold as long as possible, and he had. On the morning of the 24th, with his remaining forces reduced to a few dozen men, Nakagawa burned his regimental colors and sent a final radio message to his superiors reporting that organized resistance would cease. He then died. The manner of his death was reported to Imperial headquarters as a formal ritual death consistent with Japanese military tradition. He was posthumously promoted 2 ranks by the Emperor. Jackson was evacuated from Peleliu with his company in late September. The bayonet wounds, he had accumulated them across his time on the island. None individually severe enough to require immediate evacuation, but collectively representing a body that had been cut, torn, and stressed beyond normal limits. The coral lacerations had become infected, as the battalion surgeon had warned. He was treated at a field hospital and rejoined his unit during the subsequent rest period. The after-action process for the Peleliu campaign took months. The Marine Corps was simultaneously processing actions from multiple Pacific operations, and the documentation requirements for the Medal of Honor were extensive, requiring multiple sworn witness statements, a complete chronological account of the actions being cited, and command review at the regimental, division, and higher levels. The process for Jackson's citation moved through this chain during the winter of 1944 and into 1945. On the 7th of October, 1945, nearly 13 months after the action on the Peleliu Ridgeline, President Harry Truman presented the Medal of Honor to Corporal Arthur J. Jackson at the White House. The citation read, in part, that Jackson had, with complete disregard for his own safety, attacked and destroyed 12 enemy pillboxes and later further fortified positions, accounting for approximately 50 enemy casualties through the course of these actions. The number 50. It appears in the citation and in subsequent account of the action with the matter-of-fact quality of a logistics figure. Rations distributed, rounds expended, casualties inflicted. What it represents, set against a broader context of the Peleliu campaign, is something the citation's formal language was not designed to convey. Jackson had not fought 50 enemy soldiers in a single dramatic engagement. He had eliminated them piecemeal, position by position, across multiple days of sustained combat in terrain that was trying to kill him through heat and coral and thirst alongside the men he was hunting through their own fortifications. He had done it without the benefit of supporting weapons in most instances, without a crew, without the tactical safety of numbers. He had done it by studying each problem individually and finding the specific approach. The gap, the angle, the timing, that gave him a fraction of a chance. And when he returned to Marine line after each action, he sat down, drank whatever water he had left, and waited for the next problem to present itself. The Marine Corps has always had a complicated relationship with the kind of valor that Jackson demonstrated on Peleliu. The institution trains men to function as units, fire teams, squads, platoons, because a collective application of coordinated force is more reliable than individual heroism. Doctrine exists precisely to reduce dependence on exceptional individuals. A well-trained squad executing a sound tactical plan should not require one man to carry the weight of 12. But Peleliu broke doctrine the way the coral broke boot leather. The terrain simply did not accommodate the choreography of coordinated assault. The interlocking fields of fire that Nakagawa had engineered into the Emerbergal meant that the standard approach, suppression, maneuver, assault, often collapsed at the maneuver phase because there was nowhere to maneuver to. The coral offered no covered approach routes that a platoon could use. It sometimes offered a single approach route that one man, moving carefully and accepting a level of personal risk that could not be ordered, might use. Jackson found those routes repeatedly. That is what the record shows. What the record also shows, and what tend to be obscured by the formal language of citations, is that Jackson's actions did not take place in isolation from the men around him. Every time he moved forward alone, someone else was on the Marine line providing covering fire, drawing the attention of Japanese defenders, creating whatever marginal distraction allowed him to move. His platoon sergeant, his fellow riflemen, the machine gun crews positioned behind him, they were all part of the same action, even when their names did not appear in the citation. Jackson understood this. In the interviews he gave in later years, he was consistent on the point. He did not describe what he did on Peleliu as singular. He described it as one part of a collective effort in which the men on the line made it possible for him to do what he did. This is not false modesty. It is an accurate description of how infantry combat actually functions at the small unit level. The man who moves is visible. The men who make it possible for him to move are not. After the war, Jackson returned to civilian life in the United States. He settled eventually in the Pacific Northwest and lived a quiet life by the standards of his wartime record. He married, raised a family, and worked in private industry for decades. He was not a public figure in any sustained sense. He attended Medal of Honor Society events and spoke occasionally at military commemorations, but he did not seek the kind of ongoing public profile that some recipients maintained. He gave interviews sparingly. When he did speak about Peleliu, he spoke about it with the precision of a man recalling technical problems he had solved rather than with the retrospective drama that interviewers sometimes try to introduce. He remembered the coral, the heat, the geometry of the positions. He remembered the weight of the demolition satchel and the sound the charges made going off inside the confined coral structures. He did not embellish, and he did not minimize. He reported. This quality, the flat accuracy of his recollection, was itself a product of what Peleliu had required of him. The men who survived that island's interior by moving forward through its fortifications did so because they had processed what was in front of them clearly, without the distortion of panic or false hope. Jackson had been doing that on September 18, 1944. He was still doing it 60 years later when historians sat across from him with recording equipment. The strategic value of Peleliu, The fundamental question of whether the island needed to be taken at all became one of the most debated operational decisions of Pacific War in the years that followed. Admiral William Halsey had recommended canceling Operation Stalemate 2 as late as September 13th, just 2 days before the landing, arguing that the Peleliu airfield could be bypassed and neutralized by air power rather than seized at the cost of infantry casualties. His recommendation was overruled. The landing proceeded. The airfield was secured within the campaign's first week, but it was never used for the strategic purpose that had justified the operation. The Philippine Liberation Campaign proceeded without significant Japanese air interference from Peleliu regardless. The men who were killed and wounded in the Merbergal pocket, in the fighting that continued for 10 weeks after the airfield was secured, died for terrain that served no operational purpose once the immediate objective had been taken. This is the sharpest edge of Peleliu's legacy. It was not lost on the men who fought there. The veterans of the 1st Marine Division, who wrote about the campaign in later decades, returned to this point consistently. They had done what they were ordered to do. They had done it at enormous cost, and the purpose for which they had done it had been, at best, debatable. Jackson never spoke publicly about the strategic debate in terms that expressed bitterness, but he spoke about his fellow Marines on Peleliu with a specificity and consistency that indicated they remained present in his memory in a way that the passage of decades did not diminish. He remembered their names, their positions in the platoon, the specific things they had done on specific days. This is what combat of that intensity does to memory. It does not fade the way ordinary experience fades. It stays. Arthur Jackson died on June 14, 2021, at the age of 96. He was among the last surviving Medal of Honor recipients from the Pacific War. His death closed a direct link to the experience of Peleliu, to the coral in the heat and the 12 pill boxes, and the 50 men who had been waiting inside them on the morning of September 18, 1944. The island itself is largely unchanged in its physical character. The Merbergal ridgeline still stands. The coral is still sharp. Some of the cave openings and bunker remnants are still visible to visitors who make the journey to Palau. The rusted hulks of tracked vehicles and the concrete remnants of fortified positions mark the ground where the 1st Marine Division fought through the worst weeks of the Pacific Campaign. A memorial on the island carries the names of the Marines who did not come back. It is not a large memorial by the standards of the major Pacific War sites. Peleliu does not draw the visitors that Iwo Jima draws, or Guadalcanal. It was always a smaller story, a smaller island, a smaller operation, a campaign that even many military historians treat as a footnote to the larger Pacific narrative. But for the men who were there, it was not a footnote. It was a coral in the heat and the water that tasted like fuel, and the positions that covered each other, and the single approach through a shallow depression that a 20-year-old from Cleveland had decided to crawl through, because it was the only way forward he could find. He found it. He kept finding it. And when the Marine Corps left Peleliu and the battle passed into the history books, it carried with it the quiet record of a man who had been left for dead in the heat of the Pacific and had instead kept walking, position by position, charge by charge, all the way back to the line. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.